Darrel, I'm excited to have you here, man. How are you?
Doing great, Jeff, man. I'm excited to be on the Baseball Awakening podcast, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today, man. Every time you and I get together, we have some super deep baseball conversations, and I always learn something. So I'm excited to share with your audience today, and let's get this going.
Yeah, I agree. We do get deep, and man, I learn a lot as well. So, look, you and I, we talk a lot, and what we talk about is there are guys that teach throwing, and then there are guys that
Yep,
teach pitching,
yep,
getting guys out. And to me, you're a pitching
yep.
coach. But if we had to go by the industry standard, if there is such a thing, you would be classified as an approach guy or even a mental guy. How do you define what you do?
Oh, that's a great question. I think a couple of things. One is I try to look at baseball almost kind of deconstructing what it would take to become a major league pitcher. And again, with a lot of my pro clients, I don't even want them to look at it what it takes to get to the big leagues. I want them to look at it from the perspective of what's it going to take to have a 10-year major league career. So it's not just about getting to the big leagues or what it's going to take to get to the big leagues, but it's really about how do we redefine what it takes, and then how do we really super individualize that. And so I take a different approach. The last 13 years, I've really started studying why first, second, third round picks don't consistently make it to the big leagues. And so through a couple of studies that I went through from Simpson and Karcher that went back and basically studied the percentage of first round, second round, third round, and basically the whole draft from like 1960s on. And what's ironic about this is over the last 50, 60 years of the draft, the percentage of players that's drafted by round that make it to the big leagues is almost exactly the same. And when I start, and so with all the advances that we have in baseball training and all the medical research that's done on arm injuries, and again, there's some fantastic guys out there doing some awesome stuff. But when I sat down and started going through and interviewing these pitchers and really digging deep into why they thought they didn't have more success than they did when they were projected as the top players in that year's draft, it was an interesting conversation and dynamic that kind of came out of that. A lot of the times they thought it was a physical thing, but yet they couldn't put their finger on it. And so when we started going through this and started having a little deeper conversation, and we're baseball guys, I did the same thing. I got drafted out of high school. I played 4 years in the minor leagues, and honestly, it was a good experience, but there was some huge regrets that I had coming away from it. And being a small town guy that just never really had that kind of baseball knowledge around me, it was one of those things that you just learn by playing. You just learn by going out there and competing in the backyard or on the playground, and then eventually into summer ball or high school ball. But what happens is that there's a little piece of this that I tell these guys all the time, that it took me about 5 years after I got done playing that I finally realized that there's more to it than what I call the prerequisites or the scout skills. But yet there's such a huge emphasis at an early age to develop these physical skills, to develop the velocity, to develop mechanics, that we've missed this huge part of it, which is at the end of the day, baseball, and especially pitching, is about getting hitters out. And so what we tried to break this down to is how we really figure out how these pitchers choose what pitch they're going to throw. And so when I started breaking that question down to them, and I really started digging deeper into the psychology or the mindset on why these pitchers chose the pitches they were choosing, then we had a totally different conversation about baseball. And that was kind of my aha moment right then. That we've always, as coaches, we got this tendency to want to label things. We want to go back through and identify why we think things are happening, because we're used to managing teams, or we're used to trying to manage pitching staffs. So we're trying to come up with these ways, these drills, these skill development things that we do to try to sit here and kind of mass produce pitchers. But what I've taken away from all this research and these conversations and working with all these guys that were, at the top of the drafts, was at the end of the day, it came down to that they got released out of pro ball because of what I call the indecision problem. And when we started really digging deep into what the issue really was, it was the choices they were making when they were standing on the rubber. It wasn't a matter of physical capability. These guys were the most physically capable players in the world. They were, a lot of them threw 94, 95, 96 miles an hour. So it wasn't a mechanics issue. It was an indecision issue. And so whenever we start talking about the mental game, or we start talking about the psychology piece of it, then it kind of scares people off, because from a scout's perspective, the way we graded these kids out is that, hey, we think he's mentally tough, or we give them kind of these surface level projections or projectability that we try to gauge their pitches and their mindset and the intangibles. Again, it's just a series of labels that we've given these kids. But at the end of the day, it always came down to their inability to effectively choose the right pitch to throw. And so when I took that approach with it, Jeff, it kind of changed the way we do it. So I try to, again, to give you the quick answer for a long, drawn out question, is that it was about how we choose to pitch. And so I would define my job as a pitching strategist. I try to really take it past the prerequisite, past the scout skills, into a series that I call the strategic pitching process, which is I break it down into 4 different areas, which is the idea assessment. I really want to get to know this pitcher on an individual basis. What is their intellectual interest? So the idea is an acronym for intellectual interest, desire, their emotional connection or investment in wanting to be a pitcher, and then do I think it's authentic? And that's where I start all these conversations at. And so that is my number one basis on whether I choose to work with a client or not. They got to be intellectually interested in playing baseball, and especially pitching. And then what is their personal desires? What do they want to take away from the game? What are they hoping to get out of baseball itself, big picture, purpose-wise? And then what is their emotional connection? Why do they really play? And not just because they're good, or not because God gave them some athletic ability. I want to know really, why do they play? And so once we get to that piece of it, now we get a chance to build that relationship with this player. And that's why a lot of the consulting I do is not scalable, because it's a one-on-one business, and it's really getting these guys to open up and take it to a deeper level and really start to really focus on how they choose what pitch they throw. And that's where we kind of start the process. So I kind of, again, man, I try to give these guys the big picture view of what a 10-year major league career would look like. And then we kind of deconstruct the process all the way to the mound to how they decide what pitch they're going to throw.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you and I talk about that quite a bit. And I agree with you that this is kind of the missing link. And I think, and based on the conversation that you have with these guys, how much of this is due to the way they were coached growing up, not being able to make the decision that they need to be able to make, and not being able to do the trial and error to figure out who they are?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. I don't like blaming coaches or different things. I think people grow up and they are what they are, and they learn what they learn. I think what happens at the end of the day, the emphasis of the coach and what they think is important, whether it's a philosophical interest or whether it's a strength and conditioning or a throwing program, whenever we take a label and we try to get all these kids to fit within that philosophy, then it creates almost this filter. The kids that fit into it naturally stand out. The ones that don't, then they feel like there's something missing all the time. And so what's happened is, with these kids that have some athletic ability, or the kids that have some talent at a young age, some physical capabilities, then we start labeling them, and then we start putting them into some kind of training program or some kind of training process. And what happens then is the emphasis, while that kid's 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, is more into physical development. And then they're in this constant state of convince and compare. So they're always trying to convince a coach or a college coach or a recruiter or whoever it is, that they're physically talented enough, and they're in this constant state of comparing themselves against every other player that they see play. And so what happens is it creates this mindset that pitching is really about, okay, do I do the things that get the recruiters and the scouts' attention? And then how do I compare to everybody else? And within that mindset is where the trap happens, because that mindset is what permeates all the way up through the minor leagues and is the single greatest problem I see in baseball with minor league players. It's not physical capability. Again, these guys are the most physical, talented players that we have available to play in the minor leagues, or at least we hope they are based on what the scouts' opinions of them were. But what happens is when you're trapped in that convince and compare mindset, you never convert over into how do I individually get hitters out. And so the hardest thing I have to do with these pro guys that are so physically talented is try to convince them that, hey, you got the physical capability. You have the ability to execute these pitches, these two-seam sinkers, or this slider, or this nasty curveball. But the real deal is how do you learn how to read and study hitters, and then how do you learn when to throw what pitch in what situation and count, and it happen in real time against the best hitters in the world. And see, now that takes a mindset shift, Jeff. That means we have to go from this convince and compare mindset into what I tell these pro guys, that you've got to have this mindset shift if you're going to pitch in the big leagues. You got to go from this convince and compare into what I call this compete and contribute mindset. That now you finally feel like I'm physically capable. I got the pitches. Now it's a matter of how do I compete against every hitter? How do I decide what pitch I'm going to throw? And then how do I contribute to my team, whether it's a AA, AAA, or the major league team? And so when we start talking about deeper conversations about what it really takes to get to the big leagues, the truth is most of these major league decision makers are trying to figure out some way to get a sense on not whether you're physically capable of pitching in the big leagues. That's the easiest thing to identify while you're in the minor leagues. The hardest thing to identify is whether these guys intellectually can adjust to major league hitters who are studying them. Kind of the sophomore slump thing that I call it. You know, you have the sophomore slump. Once the league gets to see you once or twice, how do you intellectually adjust? And then the emotional stuff. How do you handle that emotional, the adjustment of pitching in that environment? How do you respond to the pressure? How do you respond to the things? Some of those things you don't ever get to realize until you actually experience that environment. But what you can see and what they try to sense is, do they have this kind of, I call it situational count awareness, that it's just this moment that they see and they understand when they're standing on that rubber getting a sign from the catcher, that they sense the situation and count, and it helps them decide intellectually and emotionally and mentally to physically be able to execute the absolute best pitch to throw in that situation and count. And that's deep, man. I get it. But that's the heart and soul of why we need to learn how to read and study hitters and master our pitches. But as long as we're in that convince and compare mindset, we never do get to the point of mastery, because we're always thinking there's something missing or there's more I need to do. And, man, that's a hard conversation with these guys that already throw 94, 95 miles an hour. And for somehow they think that my physical capability is going to magically somehow turn into this strategic process, and I'm going to learn how to honestly throw my pitches by velocity and movement to a specific location on purpose. And see, that's the shift that's got to happen, Jeff. That's the hardest part. When I talk about trying to convince these guys that they have the physical talent already, and now we got to move deeper than that. That's the hardest piece to convince them of, because all of the positive things that happened to them up to that point has been based on their physical capability. And from the time they were 12, 13, 14 years old and showed this little spark of having the athletic talent to do it, then that's what's been pushed. They've been going to the best pitching coaches, or they've been buying the best strength and conditioning programs they could get. And a lot of this time, it's not information that's missing. It's honestly, how do you get hitters out?
Yeah,
And
I agree. And let me ask you, Darrel, you talk about the intellectual interest and the personal interest and the emotional interest. So
yep,
when you're sitting there and you're talking with the
yep.
guy, how deep does this conversation have to go for you to say, yep, we checked this box of intellectual interest, he personally interested, and then he
Yep.
has the emotional interest. How
Yeah.
deep does this conversation have to go for you to say, yep, he checked the box and all the marks, and he
You
has a
know what?
chance?
That's an awesome question. Here's what it's not. It's not an IQ question. This ain't about how they will do on their ACT, SAT. That's what college coaches need for you to get in school. That's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is, can they tell me, you know what, when we start asking them when they started baseball, how old were they when they started pitching? And you can tell the way they talk to you, the way they explain it to you, whether it's something that they were just forced to do, or my dad made me do it, or my uncle thought I was a good player, so he kind of took me here, which is all good ways to start. But when I take them back to the beginning and we start having real conversations about, when did you start pitching? How did it feel, man? What did you think about it? What excited you about playing the position of pitcher? And then we start going into, and I ask them, man, what up to this point, what's been your best baseball experience? And then I ask them, what's been your worst baseball experience? And I ask them those two questions because it will tell me where they're currently at, and it will give me some kind of gauge on what they really feel. That when they're in this circumstance, here's what's happened. When a coach pushes this button, here's how they're going to emotionally react. And so when we get to that point, man, it just gives me a deeper insight of whether these guys are really playing for them, or what is their interest honestly in playing. If it's somebody that constantly talks about velocity or talks about their physical skills and talent, then I know right then that if they have the ability to get drafted or even go to a D1 school, that when they get into that environment with other kids that are just as good as them or better than them, they're going to struggle. Because what they thought, to the physical skills and ability, the scout skills, I call it, that it took them to get to that level, is not what makes you a great pitcher at the D1 level or in the pro ball. I mean, we got to start getting guys out. You know, we can project these guys all day long, but when they turn 20, 21, if they ain't getting guys out, then guess what? We got a deeper problem than physical capability. They truly don't understand it. And that's why, again, man, I know this is step on some of these guys' toes, Jeff, but that's why I will not recommend any of my guys to go to a college that the coach calls the pitches. And so I've had some sensitive conversations with some good coaches about this, and again, I get it from the perspective of that it's their job and it's all the business piece of it is them, but from an individual pitcher development, that if that kid ain't out there and he ain't intellectually deciding why he's throwing the pitch, the absolute best pitch to throw in this situation and count, then one, he's not emotionally attached to the outcome, which I don't try to keep my pitchers emotionally neutral. I try to keep my pitchers emotionally connected and invested, which is different. See, one thing is I'm trying to calm this guy down. No, pitching, every decision we make is an emotional decision. Every decision, I don't care what part of life it is, we make a decision based on past experiences, and then we label it. So when I'm teaching these guys pitch command, and when I call mastery, what I want these guys to do is I want them to literally see that pitch in their mind, feel that pitch in their fingertips, then execute the pitch. That's the 3 steps that I want them to see. But to be able to get them to see that, it has to start with an image and a pattern and an experience. That's why we throw bullpens. That's why we practice. That's why we have the fundamentals. Is so we create this image and this pattern and experience of a baseline on how it ought to be done. But once we get physically developed and once we get physically mature and we get into college and into pro ball where these guys are now men, we got to start basing our decisions on not whether we're physically capable of, but what pitches have I mastered? What do I know about this hitter that I'm pitching against? And then right now in this situation and count, what is the best pitch that I could throw by velocity and movement to a location that I have mastered? And that's why pitching is so emotionally draining. The truth is that the decisions that these pitchers have to make every pitch is what drains them. And if they're doing it right, they're doing it based on the preparation before the game, what they're reading and studying about the hitter and the umpire during the game, and then what they trust, what they know these pitches that they can master. When we sync those together, Jeff, that's where we have the most confident pitchers ever. Right then, when we have the intellectual, the emotional, the mental, and the physical all synced together. And so with my consulting piece, that's what I go through with these guys. The strategic pitching framework that I use with these guys is based on a mindset shift. It's based on mastering your pitches, reading and studying hitters, and game day strategy. And so that's what I do with most of my pro and college clients, getting them ready to play at the next level. Because when a major league decision maker that's going to have any kind of impact on whether you ever pitch in the big leagues, when you sit down with them and they start asking you questions, you know what I want you to do? I want my guys to give them the intellectual interest answers, not the, hey, I throw 94, I do this and this, the same cookie cutter answers they're going to get everybody. I want them to blow these guys away with, not only am I intellectually interested, but you know what? I know that your job depends on how I pitch too. And it's kind of that maturity, kind of that respect, and it does. It just, and that alone, Jeff, could be the differentiator between get from AAA to the big leagues and from the big leagues to having a 10-year career. And a lot of it is relationships. A lot of it is not physical talent, man. It's relationships and being able to communicate and really, really dig deeper into the business aspects of baseball too, brother.
Right. So let's go back to the conversation of the intellectual, personal, and emotional. So you have a guy, and
Yeah.
and I'm sure you've had plenty of this, but he is playing because he's good and his dad wants him to. And that kind of starts to lead the natural progression of, hey, I'm pretty good, so I might as well just pursue it. But we know that the end result, this guy's probably not going to be emotionally invested enough to get to the big prize. And maybe it's not his big prize. So how did that conversation go?
Well, you know what? Usually, Jeff, I tell them that. After I get done with the idea assessment, I just tell them. And I don't say it mean. I don't say it judgmental. I just say it for real. I ask them, hey, man, what do you really want to do? I don't get the sense that playing professional baseball or making it to the major leagues is really that important to you. And sometimes that's enough to shake them and say, oh, yeah, it is. And you know what? As men, we have a hard time opening up, period. And we don't want to admit that we're afraid of anything. We don't want to admit that we don't know what we don't know. And so we created this culture of fake it until you make it, which I hate it. I hate that analogy. And I tell them, man, you're just faking it until you fail. Because if you don't intellectually understand something, you're not going to go compete against the best players in the world and it magically appear one day. And so we got it. So we can have all the physical skills and talents in the world. But the truth of it is, Jeff, these guys that really get it, these guys in the big leagues that dominate, that not only do they know what their physical capabilities are, they know what their limitations are. So when they're throwing pitches within their capability and their limitations, because that is what the brain trusts. That is what we can master. And that's something that becomes repeatable. Now it's a matter of when do I throw that pitch by velocity and movement to a specific location. And so if I was a pro scout or if I was running a pro organization, the physical capabilities is the easiest piece to see. And believe it or not, it's the easiest piece to teach. The hardest piece to honestly evaluate is whether this guy is really intellectually interested. Because if he is, when he gets in that pro ball environment, in the minor league environment, and as much as they try to sell it that it's a team, no, it isn't. They release guys every day out of their organization because they can't play. Has nothing to do with what kind of teammate they were. Now, is that being a good teammate something that they should strive for? Yes. But if you want to pitch in the big leagues one day, you better be pretty good at getting hitters out too. And so that's the shift that has to happen in that. But when we're working with guys that are really They don't know whether they want to play baseball or not. That's okay, man. I'm not mad at them. I just want them to understand that if you want to be committed to the pro baseball, which is where most of my guys work, if you're going to be committed to that, then you got to understand that when you suck, people get fired, and at the same time, you could get fired too. And so we got to emotionally get past that, so we can really get into what I call the strategic piece, because there's a strategic gap, I call it. We focus so much on the scout skills, what it takes to get drafted, what it takes to get the scout's attention, what it takes to get the attention of the major league manager and GM. And we forgot about how do we individualize how these guys honestly pitch. And it's not these guys' fault, man. It's not these players' fault, because from the time they were 12 or 13, we've ingrained it in their head through showcases and select ball and all this other stuff that, hey, if you ain't doing this, you're not going to get noticed. If you ain't doing this, if you don't throw this hard, you're not going to get noticed. And we de-emphasize actually getting hitters out. And then we get these kids drafted, or we get these kids that show up at some big time college programs. And I don't care what program it is, you can go in bullpens at the best schools, and there's a bunch of 90-mile-an-hour arms down there, and they're in that bullpen because they can't get hitters out. Has absolutely nothing to do with physical ability. And so I think what's happened now is every time a kid's struggling that throws 93, 94 miles an hour, everybody just takes their hands off of him, because they know it truly isn't a mechanical issue. Because how we choose our pitches isn't a mechanical issue. It's not a kinetic issue. How we choose our pitches is going to be based on past experience with this hitter and what they literally are thinking while they're standing on the rubber and the catcher puts the sign down. And that's what we got to grow these guys into, man. That's the piece that I think is missing. And it's not this woo-woo psychological motivation, jack them up kind of stuff. It's really just about, do they intellectually understand how they do what they do, and do they intellectually prepare for the other team's hitters based on the patterns and tendencies and the habits and the things that we see? And then can we correlate them two together? Can we sync that information together to create a game day strategy based on the pitches that this kid has mastered? And that's what I try to do with these guys. I try to get them to master their pitches, teach them how to read and study hitters. Again, man, this is not rocket science, but when you got a sense of what that hitter is looking for, and then you can exploit that with your pitches, now we have the chess match of pitching that we love. Now we're pitching. Now it's the playoffs. That's the kind of stuff, and I love it that way.
Yeah. So how do we make this shift?
I think there's guys out there. I think there's major league teams that's starting to get it. I'm starting to see it on their questionnaires that they're giving the players. You're starting to see them ask better questions. And some of it is that, and I do it. I got guys that I prep for these interviews, and I know agents are prepping their guys for the interviews. But what we got to get to is the business of minor league baseball is a numbers game. The percentage of kids that get drafted to get to the big leagues is very little. It's maybe 10%. So 90% of these kids that got the physical capability, or at least had enough capability to sign a pro contract, most of them are never getting out of A-ball. And some of that is a numbers game, but most of that is because they don't get hitters out. It has very little to do with their physical capability. It has to do with the fact that they're playing 140 games a year. They're getting 20, 30, 40 times the opportunity, chance to pitch. And during them times, the team just ain't seeing what they need to see to keep them in the organization. That's the reality of the baseball side of it. Now, the opposite of this is the change is going to happen when coaches decide that I'm going to have better relationships with my kids, and I'm not going to force a training or a mechanical philosophy down this kid's throat. I'm going to let him instinctively, physically develop. And that don't mean we don't do strength conditioning or throwing programs or that. But what we're not going to do is force kids into an unnatural movement pattern at an early age. I honestly believe that that's the number one reason why we have so many youth pitchers hurt, is because they show a little bit of athletic ability, and then we put them in with this coach who thinks that every pitcher ought to throw like this. And maybe that's not that kid's natural arm slot at 12 or 13 years old, but we sit here and we take him to pitching lessons 2 or 3 times a week that force him into an arm slot that's not instinctive or natural. And so now we're putting all kinds of force on this kid's arm and shoulder before he's probably at lower half strong enough to stabilize. And so now we're just like pouring gas on a fire. And so really at the younger age, man, I want guys to be instinctive. And then once they start getting into high school and we see them growing and maturing into, getting closer to the man they're going to be, then we can start adding some really specific stuff that we see. And there's some good coaches out there that's got that capability of doing these biomechanical assessments, doing these stuff. I'm all for that. But I think if we start that at 13 or 14 years old, before these kids even really get to puberty or get to a point, and then we force them into an unnatural movement pattern at any way, whether it's a lower half movement pattern or whether it's a upper half movement pattern, then I think we're creating the foundation for an injury. And so once we get past that piece of it, I think there's some good voices out there that's trying to explain that, but I think the business of youth baseball and the marketing in youth baseball has conditioned parents and these kids that if they can't throw 90 miles an hour by the time they're 14, 15, 16 years old, then they're not going to a D1 school or they're not going to get drafted. And part of that might be true, but also part of that is the reason we have a problem. It's because now we're forcing kids to go ahead and try things that don't feel natural or instinctive to them, or they don't even honestly trust or believe it. And so that's the piece when I start talking about the intellectual interest, I start talking about what is their personal desire and what's their emotional connection to it. If those three things ain't in place, when they get into high school and we start making it about something that don't feel instinctive or natural to them, then they're going to quit. They're going to walk away. And that's where we lose a lot of guys, man. And it has nothing to do with baseball itself. It has to do with how we make these kids feel. What kind of position we put them in. And it's not some woo-woo crybaby macho crap. It's the truth, Jeff. It's the way we make them feel, how we make them think what we make them think baseball is going to be like. And if it's going to be this miserable, unnatural, forced thing, then why would I ever want to go to college and do it for 4 more years and under a different level of pressure?
Right. So what do we say to the guy that says this arm slot is exactly the reason why you're not throwing strikes?
Well, again, I don't think arm slot is ever why they're not throwing strikes. I think there's times that we're asking kids to do things that they're not capable of doing yet. And a lot of that might be strength and conditioning. Some of it is because they're not thinking the right things when they're standing on the rubber. They don't understand how to grip, wrist, and forearm angle. They don't understand the release point. They don't understand these stuffs that we should be training. And that's what we want to do. But we want it to be natural and instinctive. Every kid's got different sized hands. Every kid's got different sized arms and legs and strength. And so when we sit here and put a cookie cutter program in place and we run all these different types of kids through it, some of them are going to be more instinctive into that style and going to be successful. But there's going to be this other group of kids that are just as talented as they are, but that program is not the right fit for them. And so we make them feel like that they suck or they ain't any good because they can't fit into our philosophy instead of the other way around. Hey, let's find some other way. Let's adapt to something different and really turn it into, instead of it being you being systematic into my philosophy, let's turn it into how do we get hitters out, man? That's why you see so many of these coaches and these old timers talking about the playground. They just wish that summer ball was like it was back on the playground again, or the way it was in the sandlot when they were young. And the reason that is, Jeff, is because there wasn't no judgment going on. It was just winning and losing. They just played. They just went out there and played. And there's that emotional aspect of just going out there and playing, because you know what happened? When you're playing against your buddies every day, you learn their patterns and tendencies. You learn the things that they could hit and they couldn't hit. And then the next day, you see that they made an adjustment. And if they made an adjustment, you tried something different. See, that's the natural instinct that I want these pitchers to have. That if the hitter does something different, they see it, they react, and they do something that they're capable of doing, whether it's changing location or whether it's doing anything within that concept. And I think if you do that, then the mindset-wise, I think we kind of give these kids permission to be themselves. And until we can recreate that, Jeff, inside of either the academy setting or inside of the select ball setting or inside of high school, and coaches give these kids permission to be great athletes and do the things they do, but also give them permission to be themselves, then I think that's going to be the piece that kind of turns this around mindset-wise. Because a lot of these kids are a lot more physically talented than I was when I got drafted out of high school. But mindset-wise, man, they're so stuck in that convince and compare mindset that they feel like they got to convince everybody they meet that they're physically capable of playing. And then they're in this constant state of comparison against everybody else that they see, or every showcase they go to, or every tryout they go to. And honestly, it just emotionally wears them out. And if they think they're the best player, then they don't have no problem. But the second that they see two or three other kids that throw harder than them, and that's what all their confidence, the source of their confidence comes from their velocity. And now all of a sudden they go to showcase and two or three kids throw harder than them, they feel like they suck and they ain't no good anymore.
Yeah, that's a big problem at every level. The whole comparing part, hell, I did it whenever I played.
Nope. Yeah.
And I think most guys do. So how do we start working on the process? Because naturally we're gonna run into someone who we perceive to be much better than us, and then we have kind of this self-doubt. So how do we reframe the mind of a player to say, hey, don't worry about them, just do you?
Yeah, I think there's parts of it that we got to make sure that when we sit here and start evaluating these young players, we got to be careful about what kind of measurements we're honestly using. And I know nobody wants to hear that, because now summer ball and select ball and all this stuff is a business. And it really is. It almost mimics the minor leagues in the way that they approach it and the stuff they do, except for these parents are paying a lot of money to go play. And again, I'm not knocking it either way. That's a decision that parents need to make. But the reality of it is that when we put them in that environment at 12, 13, 14 years old, and we sell that as that this is how you get recognized, this is how you get noticed, this is how you get respect from college coaches and pro scouts. And we start selling that to coaches and kids and to parents, and we do that, and we're a part of that system, then we got to realize there's a psychological effect that happens on 12, 13, 14-year-old kids that ain't ready emotionally for that. They're still playing because they want to hang out with their friends. They're still playing because they love it. And most of the stuff that's above and beyond that is based on the fact that these kids now are being judged just like we're judging kids at pro tryouts, just like we're judging kids in spring training, and we're deciding who's going to make the teams and who ain't, who's getting cut and going home today. And so we're taking that kind of emotional consequence and putting it on 12, 13, 14-year-old kids, and the same emotional consequence that we put on 22, 23, 24-year-old men. Some of them are 30-year-old men, and still hate that feeling, that thought of not being good enough and getting rejected. And so, again, man, we can sit here and talk about failure. We can talk about all kinds of stuff, but there's a huge difference in trying something that didn't work than trying something that makes you feel like a failure and being judged to this extent that you don't even want to try no more. And so we got to get past this macho crap, man, that's just not real. And again, is there a physical component to pitching? Absolutely. Do I love guys that can throw 94, 95? You bet, man. That is an awesome tool to have when you're standing on the rubber deciding what pitch to throw. But if you don't know how to use that velocity, it's useless. And sometimes, Jeff, I have guys that tell me they wish they never even had that velocity, because now the expectations from the fans and the scouts and the team and the parents is so great. And honestly, intellectually and emotionally, these kids have no idea really how to use it as a pitcher. And so, man, I know that's kind of deep, and people don't always like hearing it, but it's the truth, man. It's the reality.
It is, and we've talked about that, and there is this is the missing link, and we've got to figure out how to help more kids be where they want to be. So Darrel, let me ask you, you got a guy who is intellectually, personal, and emotionally interested. He's in, and he's in, but he can't get guys out. So what now? What do we do to get this guy to understand himself and understand what he has to do to get guys out?
Great question. I want him to think strategically. Everything we do from this point then is strategic. I want him to understand his capabilities and limitations. So the first thing I try to do with these guys is put them in a mastery mode. What pitches do they throw? What pitches can they consistently, by a specific velocity range and a specific movement pattern, execute to a certain location? So what that lets us do is know that we got 2 or 3 pitches that we can honestly trust. Every pitch that we have, man, is just a pitch that's by velocity and movement to a location. And when we can consistently locate those pitches on purpose, now we can move into a strategic mindset. So now it's not a matter of when I'm standing on that rubber, whether I can physically throw this pitch or not. Now it's a matter of what do I know about that hitter? And then is this the best pitch by velocity movement to this location to throw right there in that count? And so what we do is we sit here and we identify 2 or 3 pitches that they trust, and they know that they have the physical capability to throw it. So what I want them to do then is go into what I call mastery mode or into strategic bullpens. Now we take those pitches and we fine tune the release point just to move location. That's it. I want everything to be off of their fastball movement pattern. And then we have just a different grip, wrist, and form angle and grip pressure and release point for our pitches. And so that way, that first 20 feet is coming out of their hand, the tunneling or all this stuff that these guys talk about. The hitter has to make a decision that first 20 feet, and we're not showing anything. I think you've seen it in the playoffs this year, man. Pitchers tip pitches all the time. So when one thing that we want is not just consistency, which is what I think a lot of these trainers do with these mechanics and all this other stuff. We're trying to create this repeatable mechanics that's not habitual or patternized to the point that a hitter can sit and find some cues and clues of what this pitcher is about to throw. And so when we identify that piece of it, now, Jeff, honestly, we can throw mastery bullpens, which means that we track our bullpens by velocity and movement to a location. And now the next step in the strategic process is learning how to read and study hitters. And so it's more than just the data. You know what? I want them to see how guys react in every count, man. What do they do? First pitch, second pitch, third pitch. What do they do? 0-1, 0-2. What do they do in positive counts, negative counts? What do they do second time through the order, third time through the order? Every one of us as human beings has got patterns and habits and tendencies that we have. And so all I really want these guys to do is become more sensitive to noticing it, especially when they're not pitching. And so when they're watching the other team, even in BP or anywhere else, you can see habits and patterns and tendencies when you see guys do things a certain way, a certain time, certain plays. If they get a hit the first at bat, what do they do the second at bat? If they swung at the first pitch, the first bat, what do they do the second at bat? And I know it seems almost overwhelming with the information, but what that lets us do is when we start watching games, we watch hitters differently. We're not watching it for that. We're not watching it for the outcome. We're watching, honestly, what that hitter's preparing, what he's thinking in the box, and we're seeing it in how he responds. And I think that's what you see the best pitchers in the world do, man. I call it situational count awareness. They know what pitches they have mastered. And now they go study these hitters the best they can. They take the data from the data guys. They take the information from the baseball guys. And then they see the habits and patterns and tendencies that the catcher sees. And they all take all this information, and it comes into part of the decision-making process when they're standing on the rubber deciding what pitch to throw. That's the information that I want to round up and get these guys thinking about. And that's where the strategic piece comes in. Go ahead.
Using information to help you get guys out. And what we have to remember is this has to be coached into guys. And you say, hey, watch the game, but a lot of times they don't really know what they're looking at. So you have to coach them. You have to get them to understand what they're looking at. And because there's a lot more to the game than just the results, like you said yesterday. You know, it can be an information overload, but if you start small, anything will help you get better than you are today.
No question. And what happened is whenever, and it's kind of the old attention theory, whatever we pay attention to seems like that's the most important thing, and we start seeing things that we never saw before. Once we can convince these guys to start watching games, not like a fan, but like I'm the guy that's trying to identify some kind of habit, pattern, tendency that can give us some kind of information or intellectual advantage, now the game just becomes my mastered pitches, and then which pitch do I throw in this situation and count. So we're taking that information, and I tell you what, Jeff, I tell them all the time, man, I want guys that were quarterbacks. And they say, why? Because I say the best NFL quarterbacks are the ones that do the game day, that do game film study. The ones that can study game film, the ones that see the cues and clues of the defenses, because the biggest bust in the NFL draft, it wasn't because they weren't physically capable. The problem they were having was reading defenses. It was really studying game film and identifying, having that kind of sense to be able to see these cues and clues and then understand those cues and clues in real time. So now when they broke the hoe or they're in the shotgun and they have to read the defense right there in real time, they're looking for cues and clues from the linebackers, from the strong safety. What coverage are they rolling into? And that cue and clue is going to give that quarterback the ability to pick the right place to throw the ball, or whether they're going to run a pass option or whatever it's going to be. But it's all based on this guy's being able to study game film. That's why Drew Brees is so good. Tom Brady's so good. They're not only physically gifted, but, dude, they study film. They understand cues and clues. They see patterns and habits and tendencies of defenses, and then they see it when they're bluffing it. And so what it comes down to, Jeff, is decision making, man. So when these pitchers in the minor leagues are super talented pitchers, it really comes down to how they choose what pitch they're going to throw and why they're throwing it. And I told one of my guys the other day, and a coach the other day, if you want to know something honestly about your pitchers, take them in an environment where they don't feel like you're questioning or threatening them, and honestly ask them, dude, how do you choose what pitch you're going to throw? And again, man, I do it to pro guys all the time. How do you choose what pitch you're going to throw? What information are you basing that on? And man, seriously, if it goes silent or they just look at you, that's a clue, man. That's a clue that they don't intellectually understand. They're just calling what the catcher calls. If they got a great catcher, they do all right. If they don't have a very good catcher, or a catcher, a young catcher, then they struggle because they're just basing it off of baseball patterns and habits and tendencies that really have no direct correlation to that individual pitcher or that individual hitter, or why that pitcher would throw a pitch that they have mastered against that hitter. Does that make sense, man?
Yeah, that makes sense. So now we got a guy that was drafted, and he's got, let's just say, a power fastball, but that's all he's got. And so he calls you and goes through your process, which include you asking him what pitches he has. And he says, I got a fastball, curveball, changeup, but for whatever reason, I can't locate my changeup or my curveball. So I rely way too much on my fastball. And this is something that we see a lot. So how does that conversation go?
You know what I do, Jeff? I take them right back to the idea assessment. Do they intellectually understand how to throw a changeup? We know if they throw 95 miles an hour, we know they're physically capable of throwing a changeup. So a lot of times, I think that's why we see all these pitch grip videos and all this other crazy stuff that goes on. The truth is, man, it's a trust factor. A kid that can throw 94, 95, man, I had the same problem. I was a younger guy. I threw hard. I didn't want to throw off-speed pitches. I didn't trust off-speed pitches. That's the only reason I didn't want to throw them. And then when I got into pro ball and I needed a changeup, it's probably the biggest regret I have in pro baseball. In 1988, man, I was playing. We won the South Atlantic League championship, and at our postseason exit interviews, the coach said, "Hey, man, I love the way you pitch, man, because I looked like the bat boy. I was like 5'11", 150 pounds, and I could throw 91, 92, had a good curveball, but I needed a straight changeup. But you know what, man? I just never trusted it. And there was people that I could have went home to. There was a former big league pitching coach that lived in my community, man, and you know what? I just never had the guts enough to go ask him. I felt like if at 20, that if I went and admitted I didn't know how to do something, that all of a sudden that would be like a sign of weakness. And you know what, man? I think that same attitude permeates so many minor league players. They feel like since they're a pro baseball player that all this stuff they ought to already know. And the truth is we don't. We got the physical capability and talent, but the truth is nobody's ever really gave us permission to sit here and throw a change-up grip enough to master the understanding of the feel, the grip pressure, and how that pitch ought to move, to where we can honestly take an off season and just master that pitch. And so,
I love how you talk about it. It's more of a trust thing than it is, the normal default of the mechanics. Yes. But no, you need to go out there. You need to throw more. You need to get comfortable, and you need to see what your pitchers are doing.
We got to give it an image and a pattern and an experience, man. That's what everything is in life that we deal with. Every pitch that we throw, every reason we decide the pitch to throw is based on an image of what we think that pitch is going to do, a pattern of what it should feel like so our brain can trust it, and then an experience. Whatever emotional label we gave it. The last time I pitched against that guy, I threw that curveball and hammered him, struck him out. That felt good. I label it as good. Next time he steps in the box, I'm going to challenge him with my fastball until he proves that he can hit it. And see, that is it. So the decision-making process was based on my experience of his last at bat against me. But if I seen him in the box, if I seen him in the back of the box the last at bat, and I blew him away, and then all of a sudden I see him slide up in the box a little bit, then I'm going to challenge him. If I know he can't hit my fastball, then I'm going to go ahead and challenge him in on his hands. I know he can't hit my fastball then. But a lot of times it's those little adjustments like that, Jeff, that is that sense that we have to give these kids permission to trust it. And sometimes when they're developing that, guess what's going to happen? We're going to walk guys. We're going to miss pitches. We're going to lose games. We're going to do all that stuff is going to be part of it. It ain't just something that magically happens one day and I master a changeup in a weekend in a bullpen. There's going to have to be this intellectual understanding and this emotional trust in that pitch so I can go out there and decide that this is the best pitch for me to throw in this situation and count. And at the end of the day, that's pitching. It's the decision-making that these guys make when they're standing on the rubber. Everything else is just an event or a circumstance that got them to that point. But ultimately, Jeff, pitching comes down to the decisions that these guys make when they're standing on the rubber and that catcher puts the sign down, and the amount of confidence that they have that they can execute that pitch by velocity and movement to that location. And that's what pitching becomes. And it's not a perfect science, man. But I can tell you one thing, we can't take the emotion out of it. We can't take the mental part out of it because that's all part of it. It's all part of it. And so when we go ahead and give these guys permission to be intellectual and to be emotional and to trust it, and that don't mean out of control. It just means I understand the role that it plays and how much it impacts my decision-making when I'm standing on the rubber. And once the guys that get that, Jeff, that is the aha moment. That's when they finally feel like, holy cow, and I see guys can go from A ball to the big league camp in 1 year.
Yeah.
It happens.
So let me ask you this. So you got let's use one of your guys for an example. Bad outings happen. They just happen. You don't have your stuff that one day or whatever. Your strategy's not working, whatever. What they call you and say, hey, just didn't have it, and then there's a little bit of baseball is very emotional, so you're gonna have a little bit of self doubt. Especially when you got all these guys you're competing with, and maybe you're in Double A knocking on the door, and you're like, man, I just blew it. But what's that conversation like?
You know what? The first question is literally, what were you thinking when you were standing on the rubber getting a sign from the catcher? What was you thinking, man? I mean, is it something that you're focused on your mechanics, which is an autopilot skill, I call it. Pros mechanics got to be on autopilot. If you're out there consciously thinking about your mechanics, then you're not pitching. Mechanics is an autopilot thing. It's an unconscious, subconscious thing that happens based on the information that we tell ourselves. We know we're a pitcher. We know this is the movement pattern of our pitches. And so when that catcher puts a sign down, I'm making a conscious choice to throw this pitch, and I'm trusting that my brain and my body will do what I tell it to do. See, that's mechanics, man. That's real mechanics. At the end of the day, if you're consciously deciding that mechanics is the reason you're throwing this pitch, then you ain't pitching. That's not strategic pitching. And so we got to go back, and sometimes it's and in pro ball, you have it all the time. You got these roving pitching instructors that come in and just give you a little bit of tip or advice. And what happens is, and it might be the right advice, but what happens is you give it way too much weight. You think that if I don't do this right now, if I don't lift my knee up 2 inches higher and get a little bit more into my back leg, then they're not going to call me to the big leagues. And that's how it is, man. As goofy as it sounds, when you're down there in the middle of it and it's so emotional and it's so competitive and you're in that convince and compare mindset, then you honestly think, holy cow, if I just get my leg lift right, then this guy's going to help me get to the big leagues. Even though we know it's not true, that's the story we tell ourselves. And so what happens is you get to hang on every word that these guys say. And a lot of these guys might have been giving you good advice. It just wasn't meant to be that literal. It was just about getting in a better position or getting in better timing or rhythm, tempo, and timing into your movement pattern. And so what happens is these guys honestly go out there and in the game, they're trying to do what these guys have suggested to them. And again, that's one of those things that I tell these guys all the time. If you're going to make a legit mechanical change in a pitcher, anytime you do that in season, especially in pro ball, it's not going to work. Now, you'll see guys say, oh, they made this little tweak or do whatever. But when you take a guy that's really struggling with pitch command and he's really struggling with the ability to locate anything, then that is a decision-making problem. That is not a mechanical issue. And most of these guys, it's like you said a while ago, that's the default excuse for why I'm not throwing. But most of the time, the reason they're struggling is the decision-making or what they're consciously thinking about while they're standing on the rubber. If they're consciously thinking about an autopilot skill, then we're in trouble because they're not consciously focusing on what is the best pitch to throw in this situation and count. And so that mindset shift right there is enough sometimes. But at the same time, Jeff, it's like we talked earlier. If they're still in this convince and compare mindset and they haven't switched into this compete and contribute mindset, then it's fruitless because the natural default for the convince and compare is to go back to mechanics, go back to physical, because that's what I've been comparing myself to these guys about my whole life. And so that's the toughest piece, the most frustrating piece for these minor league guys that I deal with. They got the physical ability to pitch in the big leagues. They just don't have the decision making down based on what they understand about their pitches and what they understand about the hitter they're facing. And again, it's not a perfect science, but there is a mindset that goes with that, because when the brain thinks that you got a strategy and that you can intellectually, emotionally, and physically execute that strategy, then it's going to be a lot more confident to let you go ahead and execute that pitch that you decide to throw. And so there's neuroscience that back it up that we see, and we execute what we see and feel. That's the truth. And if you can't see it and feel it, then the brain's going to slow down. And I try to tell these guys all the time, most pro guys that I see don't have mechanic issues. They have indecision issues. And when they start having indecision issues, the brain will slow the body down because it's going to go into that fight or flight mindset. And so now when you start having questions out there, when you're the center of attention and you're the pitcher and you got everybody watching you, that additional pressure in that environment, when you start having indecision issues, the brain is going to slow the body down and start really asking you whether you really want to do this. And that's why you see it, man. It's emotional to be a pitcher, man. It takes more than just positive self-talk. It takes an understanding that you got a plan, man. And if you get out there and you don't have a plan, brother, you're going to struggle. That's just reality.
Right. And the whole trusting people part, that's one of the things where you just got to keep that circle small. And there are guys all the time, like you just said, the roving instructor who has no clue who I am, but yep, he may be perceived to have the ticket. And you just have to be careful with who you're listening to and make sure that they understand who you are.
And that's human, Jeff. That's just human. It's just human, man. We all want to play for guys that like us. And I try to explain this to coaches all the time, man. Every one of us has either worked for somebody or played for somebody that no matter what you did, it seemed like they were never happy. And at the end of the day, you can, if you got the personality that you really don't care, you just leave it at the park. You just don't care. I play for me. I don't care about them. If he's a miserable old fool, that's fine. But if you're somebody that cares and you value their opinion or advice, or you think that they carry some weight to get to a goal that you want, all of a sudden now we feel like it's us that's the problem and it's not them. And so we try, Justin, we try to constantly change and tweak and screw with stuff so we never do get to that mastery phase. So when you always feel like something's missing, you never get the mastery. Your brain never honestly feels that you got this pitch mastered, that you could throw this in any situation account, or you could throw it in the right situation account anytime you needed to. See, that's why we got to get to physical capabilities. And once these guys get to their max physical capabilities, then we got to pitch inside of our limitations. And that don't mean that we're limited in what we can do. It just means that we intellectually understand that my two-seam fastball is 92 to 94. It's going to move like this. So if I'm 0-2, where do I want this ball to end up at? With this velocity, this movement pattern, and this grip to this location. See, now it sounds crazy at first, but when you really start dissecting to what a pitch really is, it's a velocity and movement to a location. And so the more you trust that, and the more you intellectually understand that is the best pitch to throw in that situation and count, and you ain't fearful of some emotional consequence to a negative outcome, that's where we get these confident bulldog. You see these guys we love pitching, Verlanders and Kershaws and Greinke. These guys are intellectually and emotionally tough, but they're bulldogs. You know why? Because they have no fear of the emotional consequence. They're pitching because they know strategically this is the absolute best pitch to throw in this situation and count. That don't mean the outcome is going to be what they want it to be, but when it comes to the decision-making process, Jeff, that it was based on their understanding of themselves, that hitter, and this is the absolute best pitch for me to throw in this count. And when you do that, you can live with the outcome regardless of what happens. That's what we need to teach these guys, man. That's what we need to teach them.
Right, I agree. So let me ask you about personalities. You know, everyone has different personalities. For your guy, do you use like a personality assessment to kind of gauge, you know, how they are, and what are your thoughts on that?
You know what? I think personality is just that. I think the value that we give it is the emphasis that the kid is going to believe it. If we go in and tell them that personality matters, I think there's a difference between personality and culture. See, the one thing I do want coaches to control is the culture, the communication, the character, how we're going to treat each other, the respect that every teammate is usually looking for when they want to play on a team. You know, there's three emotional things that I look for. Why do they play? Is it for respect, recognition, or rewards? And when I can identify that, the respect is usually the guys that just want to be on the team. They're good with it. Once they make the team, they just want to be respected for that they made the team. Now, what we want them to do is to go into this respect piece of it, but we gradually want them to move into the recognition and the rewards phase. As they start taking more and more responsibility, then we want them to be in that recognition phase where the coach recognizes that, hey, I need you to start in left field today. You're doing this. You're playing well. See, that's the second emotional factor that most of these kids are wanting to play for. They want the recognition. They want people to recognize that their hard work is turned into an opportunity to play. And then what we end up with, hopefully at the end of the day, is a group of leaders that are in this reward phase. They're not playing for respect. They're not playing for recognition. They've already got both of those. What they're playing for is to lead the team. Those are the guys that we want that's going to go out here and with the game on the line, they're the ones that's going to want the baseball. They're the ones that's going to want the bat. They're the ones that's going to carry it. And they're on every team in the world. I don't care what anybody else says. There's those people that they don't even play for the money. Literally, they play just for that opportunity, just for that reward, just for that. And that is where they get their intellectual reward from it. Their emotional reward don't come from the outcome. It comes from that opportunity to be in that situation and to know that it's on them to go out there and execute and make it happen. And so when we're developing young players, they're going to be in one of those three phases if they honestly are playing for the right reasons. So personalities can be fine as long as we communicate well, we don't disrespect each other, and as long as we got character that the coach is influencing in that, then we can start sitting and really giving the kids the individual attention that they need. We can start identifying specific things. That's why I don't like these cookie cutter practice plans, because a lot of times we're just sending these kids through this practice plan just so we can manage the kids, and we're not really individually developing each one based on where they're at and what they need in that time. And I think today there's so many good resources out there that the ability for coaches that really want to understand it on how to help the individual player, then it's there. But it's got to be based on what that young player thinks they need, and then where they're at intellectually with that information. Then we can sit here and give them all the philosophies in the world. As long as they buy into it, we're cool. But if they don't buy into it, it don't matter how great you think your philosophy is, it's useless to that kid. And sooner or later, if you got 7 or 8 kids on your team that philosophy is useless for, then it don't matter how brilliant and smart it is. It don't matter how many guys you help get to the big leagues before that. That group of kids that you have right then is the only group of kids that matters. And we can't just wash your hands and walk away from it. But I think conversations like we're having today, I hear it from coaches now. I hear coaches that are really getting into it. You see Joe Madden and these guys that are great managers based on their relationships. It's not that they don't know baseball. It's that they build a relationship. They build that trust factor. They get to know the players on a real level, not only personally, but as a baseball player. And then they can see the little things that they can chip in and help with, strategically help these guys with. But these guys, the best Major League players, have went from this convince and compare mindset to this compete and contribute mindset. So now their preparation is purely based on them going out and competing against the best players in the world, and how do they contribute to their team. And those are the players that Major League decision makers love. Those are the players that Major League managers love. And I tell them all the time, man, you'll go to the big leagues when that manager and GM's willing to get fired for you. And so what our job is to prove to them that you're Major League ready while you're pitching in the minor leagues.
Yeah, and it would be nice for a guy to kind of get out of that compare and convince mindset and just do themselves. You know, I tell guys all the time, just do you, man. Do yourself. And it's going to be a lot less stressful. That's
it, man. And I think that's the key. If you had to pin me down and say, hey, man, what is the one key to a college pitcher or a pro pitcher success? I would say it was having that mindset shift from this convince and compare to this compete and contribute, because convince and compare is about where you're at physically and what everybody else is doing. That compete and contribute is really individualized. It's about what do you got to do to compete right then in that moment in that game. So it's not just big picture view, it's really personal and intimate. So when it becomes personal and intimate, then we're a lot more apt to look at what we can do and what we can't do, and taking the things we can do and figuring out a strategy to go use it to win a game, to go get a hitter out, to go do the things. That's the mindset that I want these guys to have. I want them to believe that they got the physical capability, but I want them to turn that capability into a pitch mastery. I want them to find 2 or 3 pitches that they've mastered that they can throw consistently by velocity and movement to a location. And now let's create a strategy with those pitches to go out there and get the hitter out. And that's, to me, that's the art of pitching, brother, right there.
Right. I agree. So now you got a guy that you are working with. Mm-hmm. You know, he's a young guy, college guy, AMBA, whatever. You know, he's gone through your process. And he says, I'm going to do X, Y, Z to improve X, Y, Z. But it seems like every time you guys talk or anytime you guys connect, the conversation never really is the same. It never really goes anywhere. So what's that like?
You know what I found over the last 13 years of doing this, and now I've talked, interviewed, worked with, almost 300 D1 and minor league guys. And the conversation is usually based on 2 things. One is they truly don't intellectually understand it, and they don't want to admit it. They bobblehead because that's what we're conditioned to do as players. Most of the time we're pleasers. We just want to make the coach happy. We just want, and especially in the minor leagues where you think that coach has got some impact on whether you move up. And so we become pleasers. We just try to do whatever they tell us to do. And the biggest question I get from first time calls when I do these, I do confidential consulting calls. And when I talk to them, the first question, you know what they want, man? I wish somebody would just tell me what I needed to do. If I've heard that once, Jeff, I've heard that 200 times, literally. Just tell me what I need to do. And so what that tells me right off the bat is that now they think the reason they're not in the big leagues is because they don't know what to do, which seems kind of Captain Obvious. But the reality of it is, if we break it down a little deeper, Jeff, it's because of the decision making. They don't trust their decision making when they're picking what pitch to throw. They really don't believe, maybe, or they question it, or they have a little indecision on whether that is the best pitch to throw in this situation and count. And if they're worried about what that coach is going to think or what the organization is going to think if they give up a hit right now, then you can't pitch like that. You can't pitch with certainty and go out there and the brain pitch with that kind of pressure, because it's not real pressure. It's pressure based on a lack of knowledge, not pressure based on situation and circumstance. And that's frustrating. The second piece of it is I have that when kids are doing what the organization told them to do and they're changing the kids. When they come in and this kid's confidence is based on this process, this program. And that's why it's so hard, man, with all these great trainers out here and different strength conditioning guys and throwing programs and all this stuff. And if you draft a kid that his confidence is built in that training program or that recovery program, and now you take that kid and you put him into a pro organization who says, we don't do that here. Now, intellectually and emotionally, this kid feels like he's starting all over again. And so I tell a lot of coaches that, hey man, these kids are not clay, that you're the potter. You know, at the end of the day, you're getting the jar. It is what it is. Now, what you do with that jar is up to you and what that kid thinks. But they're not just a lump of clay. Just because they're a great athlete don't mean that you can come in and they're not intellectual and emotional beings, that I'm just going to morph them into this. I'm going to shape them into who I want to do. That is maybe the biggest myth in minor league development, is that these guys think that I can just draft these super talented athletes and I can mold them into these players. Man, that rarely ever works, because you got to have the intellectual and emotional connection. If you don't have this intellectual interest and understanding, and if you don't have this emotional connection and investment, then all the physical talent in the world is just that. It's just physical capability. But it don't translate into a specific sport, and especially pitching, into some fine gross motor skill ability. And now all of a sudden intellectually, I'm going to magically just pick the right pitch to throw in every situation and count. That's just crazy. But that's kind of what we've left it up to. And then, you know, and again, man, I'm not being harsh on these guys, but the prerequisite guys, when we get to the prerequisite, the scout skills, the developmental stuff, all the stuff that's on the internet right now for sale is all prerequisite stuff. This is, it's again, that's what I tell these guys. It's like having the 35 on your ACT if you want to get into Stanford or Harvard. You got to have 35, 36. If not, man, everybody that's trying to get in there is right in that range. But that ACT is not going to get you a master's degree from Harvard. You're going to have to go earn that thing. You're going to have to go do the work. You're going to have to go put in the time. And so that's what we think, though. If I just throw 94 miles an hour, then, yeah, it might get you into that school, but it's not going to go out there and get you a weekend starter job. It's not going to get you a call to the big leagues. We gotta intellectually understand what we're doing, and we gotta have some deeper emotional connection, because the game is so hard, Jeff, that if we don't have that interest in that connection, then man, whenever we start getting hit hard or we get rocked or we start playing against guys that are just as good or better than us, then we're going to intellectually not be interested enough to take that next step, that growth step that I have to do to become strategic. And so usually these guys tap out at whatever their physical capability is. Most of the time it's rookie ball or A ball, and they never do make that strategic change. And so a lot of times it's not about adding velocity or doing something different with their pitches. It's about mastering what they can do and then having a strategy to get that hitter out. And what happens then is the brain takes a different approach to pitching. Now it's not in that convince and compare mindset. It's in that compete and contribute mindset, which is a lot more tribal, a lot more organization team driven in. The outcome is based on me and my team competing and how I contribute to the team. And that's what sets us free, that it's not about me being individually judged anymore in that convince and compare mindset. It's more about how do I compete and contribute and help my team win, which is what every organization and coach wants. But we got to give these kids permission to get there. And if we keep comparing them with their physical skills against each other, then they're never going to get to that point where, okay, this is my skill level, this is my capability. How do I master my pitches within that capability? And then how do I read and study hitters, read the umpire that day, see what they're calling, and how do I decide what pitch I'm going to throw in every situation and count? That's the game changer, man. That's how we're going to take it to not only pro ball to the next level, but we're going to be able to help these younger high school and college guys that are starting to hit their physical maturity level, that they can see the game differently. And we're going to have better athletes that want to play, because now we've put the compete and contribute piece back into it. It's not just this physical capability contest anymore.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Routines. Let's talk routines. How important are they?
I love routines. I think there's aspects of the game that we need to be routine, that we want to drill. So I'm not against working on mechanics. It's just got to be in the right time. I'm not against that. I want this, but I want any movement pattern that we're trying to automate or we're trying to make instinctive, that we want it to be on autopilot. And so when we have this piece of it, so if there's an instinctive way that we move, and then we train, and there's so many great biomechanical stuff and measurements that these trainers and PTs and these guys can do, that they can find muscle inefficiency, deficiencies, hyper and hypo, all these different things that they can do with these kids to individually help them be as strong and stable as they can, which is a great thing. And I think the sooner that we do that with younger players, the sooner that we start giving that mindset to these kids that, hey, this is about me individually continuing to mature physically into the young man I'm going to be. So once we keep the physical development piece straight, but I think what happens now is we start judging that physical development and we start labeling these kids. Here's a velocity kid, here's a command kid. Here's a velocity kid and command kid. And the only difference between the two is one of them is more physically developed than the other one. Has nothing to do with pitching. Has everything to do with physical capability at that point in time that we're taking the snapshot. But what happens intellectually and emotionally is when we start labeling these kids and we start telling them that, they start believing it. So all of a sudden now when we get to high school and we really need these kids to do both, we need them to intellectually grow and understand how to master their pitches and how to get hitters out, and we need them to physically continue to develop and grow, then we got to be able to sync those two together. We can't divide those two. And I think that's the piece that, that we see in sports today. That, and again, we can go back to the quarterback analogy, that Drew Brees is a great physical quarterback. He's not 6'5", but he's got all the physical capabilities he needs, but he understands his limitations, and his strengths is in reading defenses and making the right choice of where to deliver the ball to. And so that is a process that he learned over a course of learning how to study hitters or study defenses. And when we see that piece of it, he can start looking for the cues and clues. It ain't like he's learning the whole other team's defense every week, but he knows that there's a fundamental situation they're going to be in. And so when he comes in up by down in distance, he has a pretty good idea of how that defense is going to line up. So he sees this foundational formation that the defense is going to be. Now he's looking for little cues and clues out of individual players on that defense that's going to give him a clue or a signal to what they're going to do. Same way with pitching, man. And we can teach this in high school and college, but we gotta change the conversation from this convince and compare mindset and get into this compete and contribute mindset. And we got to get more individual, Jeff, into that. And so until we do that, then, and again, man, I try to tell these guys that pitching or baseball is a paradox sport, man. It's an individual team sport. There's a team aspect to it, but truthfully, there's 9 players out there, all in different positions, all got different roles and responsibilities, and they train each one of those positions individually. You know, you don't train pitchers to be a third baseman. You don't train third baseman to be an outfielder. They got specific things that they do just for that position. And so we got to train players like that. We got to train them almost like golfers or tennis players. We got to take their strengths and their capabilities, and we got to show them how they can take what they're capable of and use it in a competitive environment, use it in a way that gives them a strategic advantage. And that's why I call it the strategy gap. I think that's what's missing. It has nothing to do with physical capability and talent. I think it has to do with individual strategy and what that pitcher is honestly thinking when he's standing on the rubber getting a sign from the catcher. And I think at the end of the day, if I was running a pro organization, that's the one question I'd be asking my pitchers every day. And it wouldn't be judgmental. It would be honestly where I want to intellectually understand why they think that. Do they trust a pitch way more than they should? Are they putting too much reliance in this pitch in one situation to count, or they throw this pitch every 2-2 count? See, those are the habits and patterns and tendencies that good hitters pick up on. And so, again, all of us have them, but a lot of times if we're having success, we don't pay no mind to it. And that's something I tell these pro guys too all the time, man. I've never seen them take a pitcher that was pitching just lights out and change his mechanics. Even though they might think this guy has got the jacked up, this dysfunctional looking mechanics ever, if he's getting dudes out consistently and he's pitching well, they are not changing that guy no matter how bad they think his mechanics are. And so, again, man, at the end of the day, it comes down to getting hitters out. If you're getting hitters out, you can do it in the ugliest ways ever, and some coach will love you for it, and that's okay. But at the same time, as long as we're using these scout measurements and these scouting reports, and that's the physical measurements that we're using, then we're going to get that type of kid. And the kids that intellectually are interested and are emotionally invested and can get into that compete and contribute mindset are the ones that end up making it to the big leagues.
Let's talk about routine and let's talk about routines in terms of, like on waking up on game days and
sure. Yeah. Well, that's the gist of what I do. I call it START, man. It's STARTT. It's specific thoughts and actions required today and tomorrow. And so what I try to get these guys to do is I call them daily think sheets. Is I want them to get up and focus on specifically just what they need to do today. And we cover all 4 aspects, the intellectual piece of it, the emotional piece of it, the mental piece of it, and the physical piece of it. And so within those concepts, what do we need to do today to make sure that we're moving the ball forward? We're doing what we need to do, and that's in season, off season, and preseason. And so what it does is it just gives them a structure based on how much sleep they get. What are they eating? And so we can start honestly measuring and tracking and testing what is the best foods for them, what is the right amount of sleep for them. And again, there's sometimes, especially in the minor leagues when you're on buses a lot, you can't control all that stuff. But what it does, it lets us start seeing that here's the tendencies that I have. When I have 7.5 hours sleep and I eat at 8 o'clock in the morning and I do this at 2 o'clock and then I go into my pregame routine, that is what I need to do to get my subconscious ready for me to go out there and intellectually and emotionally and physically pitch the game today.
Yeah, I try to get some quality time with our guys on routines and getting them to understand the value of it. And it can be kind of a tough sell for a younger guy, but it's worth mentioning over and over and over until they get it, because once they get it, then they start to find consistency.
No question. And I think we got to give them time to adjust. I think sometimes, and I'm guilty of it, I throw the whole kitchen sink at these guys, and I have information overload, and that's 100% my fault. That's not their fault. I just want to, but we want to start with maybe our sleep habits, then move into our nutritional habits, and you just kind of slowly do this. But I think what happens is the habits and routines match the level of success they're having, and vice versa. The more success they have, the better their habits and routines get, because they start looking for habits and patterns and tendencies of why I was successful. And so I think some of it is just a conversation. It's not just a habit to be a habit, and it's not just a habit because that's what we need to do. It's a habit because strategically that's what helps me prepare to go pitch today. And so that's what we base it on. And so there's a lot of times we have to filter out stuff that I say, hey, man, if you can't tell me honestly how that's helping you be a more strategic pitcher or how it's helping you stay capable and healthy, then we've really got to question why we're wasting time on it. Because the brain is neutral. The brain only measures what we put into it. It only labels what we label it. It only gives value to what we give value to. And if you don't think that your routine and habits has anything to do with your pitching success, then they're not going to do it. If they think that it has everything to do with their pitching success, they're going to do it almost to being perfection. And again, both sides of it can be almost too crazy because we want it to be instinctive and true to that pitcher. But it's one of those things that in today's society, man, we want everything today. We want it fast. And I think most scientists and most, neuroscientists will tell you it takes 60 to 70 days to really change a good or create a good habit or a bad habit or to really develop a habit. And so a lot of times we ain't consistent enough to get to that point where it truly does become a part of our mindset on that we think is why we're having success is this routine. And so that's why that's what you guys can do, man. That's what we do. We gotta just be consistent. We gotta get on them. And to be honest with you, Jeff, it's the hardest part of my job because it's not scalable. There's only so many guys you can work with. There's only so many guys that you can, hours in the day that you can try to help. And within that, I think there's the ability for coaches to manage that, but they're going to have to work together with guys like us that are really trying to just help kids get to a point that they can go compete and contribute at any level, at whatever level that their ability will let them go play at. And I hope that that's what baseball turns into. And again, I hope that's what all of youth sports turns into, that the kids that are dedicated and committed are the ones that will intellectually be interested and they'll carry the game forward because they'll carry the right parts of the game forward and they'll keep it at that competitive level that people want to go watch and play at, man. And that's cool.
Yeah. And the thing that I hope that people who are listening are picking up and realizing is everything the conversation. So it's a conversation. You got to talk. You got to build trust with your players, and you got to have the conversation, whether it's uncomfortable or not.
Yeah, and I think you've nailed it. I think the most important part for us coaches is that we care, that we honestly care about them as a person first, and that's probably the biggest turnoff I have, man. Is that the guys that I just don't, that don't feel it, don't get it. That's usually the discernment that hits me is that truthfully, they don't care. And if they don't care, then man, you ain't fixing that. That's something they have to change. They have to do. You can guide it for a little while, but we waste too much energy on super talented guys that really don't care instead of focusing on the guys that may be just talented, that do care, that can turn into a super talented pitcher. And so I look for those guys. I look for the guys that maybe that's not riding that physical talent. And again, it goes into the idea assessment. Are they intellectually interested? Can they explain to you how they throw their pitches and why they pick what pitch they throw? I'm telling you, that's the one takeaway. If they don't take nothing away from this podcast, go ask your pitchers why they throw the pitches that they throw. And if they can't honestly, intellectually, and that don't mean they have to break it down kinetically or all the other crazy stuff that's out there today, but they got to have a thought process on why they chose that pitch. But you got to do it. You got to do it in a non-judgmental way. It's got to be more curiously. It's got to be more inquisitive, and it's got to be in the fact that, hey, man, what that will tell you right off the bat is whether this kid's just throwing what the catcher calls and hoping. I call it wishful thinking because it's not strategic. It's just wishful thinking. And I got minor league guys like that. They have no idea why they throw the pitch they do. They just throw what the catcher calls and hope for the best. And that's not a strategy. That's wishful thinking. And so again, strategy don't have to be perfect. It just needs to be yours. It needs to be personalized. It needs to be based on the pitches that you've mastered and the information that you know about the other team and the hitter you're facing. And then you can make an intellectual choice, an emotional choice on what's the best pitch to throw. And the guys that do that are the ones that have the most success. And that's just as real as it gets, man.
Awesome. Well, listen, Darrel, this has been a great conversation. So let's kind of end it with if I just got done listening to this conversation, and I'm sitting here saying, "Geez, this is so much information. It's kind of overwhelming." So, what's my action item? What can I do? What can I take away from this conversation that it start getting me down the path to helping my pitchers get guys out?
Yeah, first of all, I think for all of us that we have to take a step back and realize that, yeah, there's some physical prerequisites that it takes to be a good pitcher. But at the same time, they're just prerequisites. They ain't the strategic identity of these young players. And we got to stay away from labeling these kids too early. And so, again, I know, I'm not hammering showcases. I'm not into all that. That serves no purpose. We can agree or disagree or love it or hate it. That don't matter. At the end of the day, it's a reality that's happening. There's parents and kids and coaches that want to play and do it, so we need to help them. But the best way to do it, honestly, is to really find out. And I did a program with Paul Reddick that we had some fun, and it was really neat. Paul's a great guy and a really insightful youth coach and does a lot of great things for baseball. And we went through an 8-week program with some of his parents and some of them, and it was based on, do they really know whether their kid honestly wants to play baseball or not? And if they do, then here's what we can do to help. And so that's what I tell every parent, every coach, whether they got 10 kids on a team, they're doing town ball team, or they got a select ball team, have a good enough relationship with your players that you could go up and ask them, what do they like that's not baseball related? And I do it with my recruiting piece of my program that I do with these guys. I tell them all the time, the first schools that you ought to look at are the schools that you would go to if you wasn't playing baseball. And people are like, what do you mean? I was like, what school would you pick? And you know what some kids tell me? I wouldn't even go to college. Okay, then you know what? Go to JUCO. Go somewhere that you don't have the pressure of being a D1 guy that coaches get fired if you suck. You know what I mean? Pick a school and pick a school. And at the end of the day, what it does is it just gets the mindset of the parents and the pitcher right. Let's go to college for the right reason. Let's go to college because of, and it's something that I want to do and that I can add value to that coach and that organization or that team. And then let's do it based on, what do I really want to do with the rest of my life? That baseball is just an avenue to help me either get my school paid for or just another 4-year experience I want to have, or maybe it turns into a Hall of Fame baseball career. But at the end of the day, players play for experiences. Every one of us that coach, we coach for experiences. It's not just a day in, day out grind. That's just part of what we do. We coach so we can see these kids achieve and live out these baseball experiences that only comes from the dedication and the hard work of the guys that really care. And so the things I love most about coaches and parents and that, man, is that they care. The coaches that care, man, we can help them. All the baseball guys out there, all the baseball gurus, geniuses out there, the parents and coaches that really care, we can help them guys. But the ones that don't care, that are only doing it for their own experience, not for the experience that the kids can have and the parents can be a part of and the coaches can be a part of. And so I think what happens is us coaches need to take more of a guide, more of a leader, a mindset to it, an approach to it, instead of it being about us and our philosophy and how many of these kids can I prove that my philosophy is the best philosophy ever in baseball development, and really kind of flip that script around and honestly say, hey, man, what kind of baseball experience are you looking for? And then, you know, based on physical capability and based on intellectual interest and based on emotional connection and based on, are they really mentally focused on what they want to do? That kind of gives us the cues and the clues and signals as coaches and scouts and as college coaches and recruiters about those are the kids that are going to have the best opportunity to be successful. And those are the ones that we need to be scouting and recruiting. But we don't need to be hammering 12, 13, 14-year-old kids in the ground and driving them away from baseball because we got to label them before they've even reached puberty. And so that's what I would leave you with, brother. I would tell every parent, youth coach out there, get to know your kids, honestly. Give them a value besides baseball And honestly, if baseball is their passion and desire and they have the physical capability, then encourage it. But if it's not their passion and desire and they just want to be respected, they just want to play with their friends, then give them a role and responsibility if they're good enough to make your team that fits that respect that they're looking for. But you can't put them in that recognition or reward role because they're going to fail at it. But the only way we know that is if we have real honest conversations with these young men and these young players, and we don't be mean and hateful about it. We're just real about it. And that don't mean that you're insensitive. It just means that when we talk to parents and coaches, we put them in that respect, that recognition, or that reward role instead of saying you're my starter and you're never going to do nothing but pinch run. Just say, hey, man, they want to be on the team. And when you have that conversation with parents and you ain't charging them insubordinate amount of money and different things about it, Jeff, then we have a lot better relationships, and these kids and these parents have a lot better experiences, and it ends up being fun for coaches too. But I think most coaches struggle because of the experience they create for their players and the atmosphere and the environment that either the parents are controlling the experience or the coach is over controlling the experience. And at the end of the day, we got to let players play. It's got to be fun. It's got to be something they want to do. And the truth of it is if the parents and the coaches try to make it to be the best experience that these players could have every day, then all of us would do a lot better at our jobs at the end of the day.
I agree. And Darrel, I appreciate your time. I learned a lot. Thank you for coming on.
Hey, buddy, I love you, man. I appreciate you. You're doing a great job, man. I'm looking forward to see how this goes for you. And then anytime I can help, brother, you just let me know. I'm glad to do it.